Hi, I'm Victoria. I am the social media coordinator for Renegade Game Studios, and I am joined by an assorted group of amazing people. Why don't we introduce each other, or ourselves rather, unless we want to introduce each
I'd
other?
like to. Can we
Uh,
introduce each other? That's kind of fun.
we can introduce each other. Who would you like to introduce, Spencer?
Oh God. I want to introduce. I want to introduce Doug. No, it's okay. We don't have to introduce each other. That seems like excessive.
That does. So, Christopher, why don't you start?
Hi, I'm Christopher J. De La Rosa. I am partner at Hunters Entertainment, working with Renegade to do role-playing game development and other publishing things. That's what I
All right.
do.
Doug?
Hi, I'm Doug Lewandowski. I'm the designer of Aunt Agatha's Attic and the co-designer of Kids on Bikes, Teens in Space, and the upcoming Kids on Brooms. And I'm super excited to be here. And my pronouns are he and him.
Thank you. Mine are she, they, by the way, everyone. Spencer.
Yeah, I'm Spencer Stark. I'm the designer of Icarus and co-designer of Kids on Brooms, and then also the designer of the upcoming Alice is Missing, which is on Kickstarter now. And pronouns are he, him.
Yeah. Cleo.
I'm Cleo Yensu Davis. I'm a game designer and writer, and I've done some writing for Kids on Bikes and Teens in Space. I also do LARP writing and interactive fiction, kind of in the other sphere of my life. But yeah, pronouns are they, them, and she, her.
Fantastic. Christopher, what are your pronouns? So we get it correct.
He, him.
Okay.
I mean, you draw your own conclusions, I suppose, but okay.
All right. So if we're talking about unique systems and designing unique systems, first I think we should probably define what a classic system is. So what makes something unique? What makes it stand out from what a classic RPG system would be? So why don't we start? This time we'll go the opposite direction. Cleo, why don't you start?
I have a very self-centered answer for this, actually, which is that it's classic to me if I've played it a bunch, and it's unique to me if I haven't really played it quite as much. And really, it's just kind of the test of time, because anything is going to become classic when it's in existence for long enough and enough people get exposed to it. So that is my very selfish, self-centered answer.
No, it's a fair one. Spencer?
Yeah, I think that looking at the kind of games that are currently in the market, if we're looking at what is most prominent, right? And this sort of goes to speak to your point, Cleo, like what is the most prominent in our current industry? I think it's something that is, on the more tactical side, I would say, tends to be more classical, tends to have the general stat blocks. Tends to have the general stat blocks of like strength and dexterity, these kinds of things, and then also tends to be fantasy. Tends to be fantasy and have a kind of European focus on it, a medieval fantasy European focus. That's what I think of when I think of classical.
Yep, that's what I think of when I think of a classical RPG. Doug?
I would totally agree with what they've both said. And I think also the idea that the focus is on conflict in a classical RPG, that the focus is on fighting against something, either with roles or with actions or whatever, as opposed to seeking to build something harmoniously, or seeking to build accord with either other players, which usually happens in RPGs, but also with like NPCs and stuff like that, that in a lot of the classical ones, we're against them in some way.
Mm-hmm. Christopher?
Well, I had the benefit of going last, so I get to say, yeah, those all sound really great. everyone. My opinion of it's really formed more by style, because I think there's a lot of classical RPGs that are being made modern in the sense that they have been developed recently. Because it's easy to say, oh, back in the 80s and late 70s, classical RPGs were this, and they were all like that. And to an extent, that's true. You have your Rune Quest and D&D, and everything's very mechanical. And I think the key watchword for the delineation between classic and modern is the word storytelling. I don't think storytelling was exactly emphasized too heavily early on, because more along the lines of making a system work, because it's an offshoot of tabletop game, wargaming, which is more of a strategy based, and it becomes like a tactical combat sort of thing. And there are plenty of RPGs that are like that nowadays. And I didn't mention the ones that I developed in the introduction. Outbreak Undead, I would say, falls into that line as a classical one, because it's more strategy, survival horror sort of thing. Compare that to the one we're doing, Altered Carbon, which is a lot more storytelling oriented, because it's meant to keep the pace of the show and the novel, frankly. But I think that's the biggest difference. And I think I don't want to take up too much time with this answer, because I could talk about this for a long time. But I think it's really just the emphasis on story, and bringing that into story elements in even mechanical design is relatively new. And so I'd say that's the difference between a classical and a modern RPG.
Okay. So what we're saying, just to kind of sum it up, is we have something that's been around on the market for a while, in order to become classic, something that focuses on tactical conflict, Western European fantasy, and something that maybe doesn't have as much storytelling. It's more mechanical. That fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then that brings me then to, how have you seen games change in the last few years? There's still those classic kind of games still being made, like you said. They're still on the market. They're still very popular. But how have you seen them change to that, to start adding more of that storytelling elements? And how are they doing that in surprising ways? Why don't we start with Spencer?
Sure. Yeah. When I think of these, when I think of the games that impacted me in that way, somebody coming originally from Dungeons and Dragons, 5e obviously did sort of an overhaul to be a little more accessible for people. But playing something like The Quiet Year, or something like Dialect, or one of these games, I think that those sort of reflect this. Story Prompt for the Queen is another good one that sort of reflects this storytelling focused gameplay, right? And oddly enough, it's sort of pulling from board games or card games, which aren't in and of themselves narrative in most ways. RPGs are usually, I think, a little more narrative, but because they're using, I feel like because they're leveraging tools that people are more familiar with because of board games, they create an accessibility for people that maybe aren't used to just staring at a character sheet and having to make a story out of that. I also think that there are in things like Masks, the new generation, or Apocalypse World or Dungeon World, or any of these sort of things that are more in the indie scene, even Blades in the Dark, right? They're asking you these questions that are evocative and that pull, like the mechanics are story minded. They're designed to take your answers and wrap them into the actual structure of the session that you're running. I think of like your backgrounds from, I think they're called backgrounds or backstory from Masks, right? And you take all of those questions that happen there, and then what happened during your first fight with this group, you take all of that and you wrap it into the first session, right? And that's how you plan out your first session, is using your players' sort of ingenuity and riffing off of their thoughts. I think that's something that indie games are doing a really good job of lately.
I'm actually doing a session 0 of Masks for people today. I'm excited after this.
Yeah. So exciting. That's awesome. It's so good. Oh,
Yeah.
It's so good.
Well, and that's
I
one that John evangelizes super hard. Like people keep saying, "Hey, you guys should do like teens and tights," and every time John says, "Nah, masks exists." Like, and that's it, right?
100%.
I did I had you were talking about board games, so I had a follow up question about that. What do you think then about board games such as Clank Legacy, which are taking that traditional board gaming aspect, but then adding that RPG element and this multi-campaign storyline?
Yeah, I mean, I see it like a spectrum, right? Like we have RPGs here and we have board games here, and they're just kind of doing this. They're just kind of like closing in on each other, I think. And at some point we're gonna get this collision, and I think we already have in some respects. There are games like Legacy of Dragonholt, or I'm trying to think about the other ones I have on my shelf that are kind of like that. Even like Sherlock, the consulting detective, feels very much like it has. There's also those books from which are a whole different matter, but the books from I have them up here. I can't spot them, but they're like adventure books. They're basically like choose your own adventure, but they're RPGs. So we're sort of getting this like collision of from all these different avenues, and I think it all sort of exists on this weird, maybe even like a 4-axis spectrum, right? Of like it just matters where you drop that dot between novel and video game and RPG and board game. I think it can kind of float around.
Christopher, how do you feel that the games are changing in the last few years?
Well, I'll say the storytelling thing is relatively new. I mean, it relatively isn't like I would say once White Wolf started doing their World of Darkness series, that and arguably, and actually I've had people at Paradox kind of admit this, that they would consider the Star Wars RPG from West End Games to be a progeny to like what they were doing. And I agree. That was actually the game I cut my teeth on for role-playing games. It was not Dungeons and Dragons. I was actually too dumb for it. Glad to see that's changed the bar for it. No, I still can't play second ed. That's why I make games, is I can't play them. That's unfortunate. That's more true than I care to admit. But at the same time, I do see a lot more people using it more like a collaborative storytelling effort. And I think just mentioning Session Zero, that's completely new. Like I can't imagine doing that a decade ago, or heck, even I would say even 5 years ago. It may be an informal version of it, but having it being actually called out and said, here's what you do, here's the grounds, the points you need to cover, basically involving the players in in the campaign building or the storytelling, if you will. And there's pros and cons to that. I think more pros than cons, generally speaking, but I think the element of surprise is always fun too, but that's not always a good thing. At the same time, if you want to have something that's going to be long lasting, you want to make sure they're invested in it, and they could develop that over time, or they could be they could know what they're getting into head on and just be, I want to be a part of this. And it really depends on the length of the game you want to play and the complexity of it. But I think just in general, just seeing more player involvement in how the game is played and run is the biggest development. And I said you could pick it, like I said, the spectrum into the spectrum, where on that spectrum your dot on the dot happens to be. So I don't know if there's any like, clearly this is an example of this and there's an example of that, because there's a bunch of dungeon crawl board games that are spiritual successors to Hero Quest, or at least they want to be. And then there's stuff like, and like trying to think of another one that's just like, it's strictly speaking a board game, but it's got the elements of RPGs in it. I mean, you mentioned Clank, that's a good one. But I'm trying to think of others, but I just can't think of off the top of my head. But I think like Dungeon Saga is another one. So it's stuff like you see these things basically using mechanics from the past, but integrating like role-playing elements that would become more common based on the development of storytelling systems.
Well, I think even something like Imperial Assault, right, or the Arkham Horror board game, like these feel like things that even if they aren't inherently RPG, like role-playing game defined as role-playing games, you totally do when you're playing them. So it's interesting. And not to mention like the fact that you have one player playing all the bad guys and then all the other players playing characters, like that's totally stolen from role-playing games.
Yeah, and it's I think you could even say that legacy systems in general for board games is extremely new, and that's definitely a role-playing game thing, because who cares otherwise? It's like you got something that's based on what's happened in the past, which is a cool idea. But there's nothing not role-playing game about that. That's definitely something that was derived from that scene.
Cleo?
I feel like right now, and of course, like our answers are probably going to change like 2 years from now, definitely 5 years from now, just as things change, right? But for me, what I look for is like kind of how heavily the game emphasizes the mechanics. So I think of traditional games as being very mechanics heavy, and like the kind, even maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there would have been a time when playing Dungeons and Dragons where if like there's a debate about the rules, if there's something that's a little bit like questionable, we will spend an hour trying to figure out what the exact, like we will spend that time because the rules feel very, very important. But I feel like the culture has changed because of the way that other games are changing. So now like we will not spend that time, even if we're playing something very traditional, because we've kind of like grown used to this other way of playing. So yeah, I think the main change has been, like, as we've all been kind of saying, this emphasis on storytelling and not being quite as strict about the mechanics. And generally kind of there's a less of an emphasis specifically on math. And I'm dyslexic, so for me, I have like a personal gauge of if this game is making my dyslexia hurt, then it's probably traditional or very like inspired by traditional games. But if it's not, then it's probably much more recent.
Doug?
So I can't remember if this was something that Spencer and I were talking about or something that Cleo and I were talking about, since we're all working on games together. But it was to build off of what everybody's saying, the idea that like ultimately the game that I want to make is one that says, tell a cool story with your friends. And that's the whole total of the rules. And yeah, the more that okay. And the more that like the rules of the game can get out of the way, the better. And I think modern games are doing that better and better and better and better, right? Like Cleo said, like I've spent hours arguing over like, well, how many vials of Greek fire could you hit a Tarrasque with at a single time? And like it matters because as opposed to like, oh yeah, you guys really like figured that one out. Good job. In more modern storytelling games. And then the lightness of the mechanics building into that sort of like, let's just keep this rolling. So that nobody feels like, hey, I can't play second ed. Like I can't figure out how the heck to do THACO. So I'm out. So I think that's one big thing. And I think another way that it's changed, and I don't know if this is just for me personally, but having it matter whether you win or lose. Like in second ed, and maybe it's because I was playing this in like middle school and high school, like I cared if my character got what they wanted. And now with like more modern games, like if my character dies in an amazing way that contributes to the story, perfect. Like that's great. I'm here for it. Wonderful. Like the game that Cleo and I are working on is going to have like a 1/3 mortality rate. So at least that's the goal of characters, not players.
Good. Glad. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah,
we're all wondering.
Yeah. You're gonna ask me to play test it, and I was gonna ask.
Right. So. Yeah. Well, we're not gonna play test it, but we're gonna ask other people too.
It's the Russian roulette of RPGs.
That's right.
I would say that there's also, and I've mentioned like I would say that Outbreak Undead falls in the traditional structure that's very tactical strategy based. I've seen more people come, and that has an extremely high mortality rate because by design, because you're supposed to be a realistic element to it. If you're going to survive the zombie apocalypse, chances probably no. And so I've seen people develop a sort of like, I want to go out, but I want to go out like a badass, or I want to be able to be the guy who's a thumbs up as it goes down the lava. I want to be that guy. That's me. And so I think it's not exactly, strictly speaking, a storytelling versus mechanic one. It's just a matter of the kind of setting you're trying to set. You know, if you're wanting to be, you know, can we all survive this? And the answer is probably no. Otherwise, there's no tension. There's no reason to play really. I think it's just a matter of what kind of genre it is, not so much that, it's delineated by traditional versus modern gaming.
I also wonder
We
if I also wonder if
Go
like
ahead.
something like Fiasco plays into this as well,
Mhm.
where it's like you know that you're going to have these sort of, things are going to go bad for your characters. They're absolutely going to go bad for your characters in some way, or there's some sort of ending that you're all working towards, and working with this within those parameters, almost like an improv game, but with some mechanics that make it so that nobody knows what's going to happen. Like that's also a really interesting space, and I think Jason Morningstar was one of the leaders of that charge. And so that was sort of a fascinating look at the way that RPGs were moving for me as well when I first got into designing.
And Fiasco
funny.
was the first game for me where I didn't want my character to get what they wanted, right? That was the thing that like broke me
Yeah.
at that. Sorry, Cleo.
Oh, no, I was gonna say in the LARP world and probably in the tabletop world as well, but we talk about something called playing to lose, which is where, especially like in the Nordic LARP scene, right, where there's a lot of emphasis on let's make for a good story by making all our characters really miserable, and I'm seeing that much more now in tabletop RPGs, which I really like. In some cases, sometimes you don't necessarily want to play the most miserable game of your life, but I think kind of, what do you call it, like type 2 fun, right, or something. It sounds like there's some term for it where it's like it's not fun in the traditional sense of like a normal game, but it's fun in the way that like watching a really good movie that's also really depressing and meaningful might be. So that's an interesting kind of thing I've been noticing a lot.
Yeah, it's funny, both
Yeah.
with Icarus and with Alice, that's the kind of fun that I've been trying to capture, I think, inadvertently, not on purpose, but like it's sort of it's because Icarus, you always lose in a sense.
The end
It's
is
always
inevitable,
going to
right?
fall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The same with
exactly.
games like Downfall as well.
Downfall. Downfall's so
Yeah,
good. Yeah.
it's very
And-
good. Or like The Watch. I don't know if any of you have played The Watch.
Yes.
It's one of my
Mhm.
favorite
Watch
games.
is- yeah.
But it's heartbreaking. It's the type of game that people cry at the table when playing it, but it's feeling. Now we have a comment from our audience saying, do social party games shade into RPG territory? Games like Secret Hitler, The Resistance, King's Dilemma. Do you think that they're kind of
I would
bringing into there?
I would say yes, and that they could do more of that. And I think that the more of that they do, the more accessible they will be for players. I have a murder mystery game that I'm working on that is basically like a murder mystery dinner party kind of game, but it's not the traditional like, oh, everybody gets the like sheets or like those box sets that you can get from Target or whatever. It's a role-playing game, but it's designed to be a murder mystery party essentially. And so that kind of thing where you can pull people in and go, hey, this is a party game, but it's actually a role-playing game. It's actually kind of a LARP. Is really exciting to me.
I've written a few for my friends like that because I'll host them. And a lot of my friends aren't really into RPGs and they have no idea that they're LARPing, but I have a good giggle behind the scenes. Like, hee hee hee, little do you know, but we're having a great time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and there's also and party games like that. There's also, it kind of brings up, especially if you have to bluff. Any game you have to kind of bluff the audience, it brings in a whole new element to it. I think I've even seen One Night Werewolf do a lot of that kind of stuff. When you're especially trying to disguise, I think if you're familiar, trying to disguise the werewolf's identity. And so I've seen some pretty intense role playing just by virtue of how good of a liar they have to be, just to protect the identity of who is obviously the werewolf. But that's kind of the kind of stuff you see. But I don't think it's a matter of like bamboozling them into playing a role-playing game when they ought not to, or they wouldn't not normally. I just think it's if you're getting into a situation where it's competitive, but at the same time, it's like the room loses and wins as opposed to this one person loses and wins. I think that's the kind of stuff that brings out the whole role-playing element to it without it being like, aha, we tricked you into playing a role-playing game. That's just what I've seen.
Yeah,
I'm totally fine to trick people in playing role-playing games, but this is me.
Guilty. So Now that we've talked about how things have been changing, what is something you would love to change? Let's say someone said you got to change something about RPGs. What is it that you would say, yeah, I want to see this? All the thinking hats are on. Okay, Doug, you start.
All right. I want RPGs to be a way to learn meaningful things about different cultures and a meaningful way for social education to occur.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
Totally agreed. I think that I would like for them, and I'm attempting to sort of do my best to lead this path, but I want to see them utilizing modern technology and leveraging the resources we have at our disposal in this kind of world to create unique experiences. We have such an opportunity to move things even off the page or off the table in a way that will create immersion and I haven't seen that utilized as often as I think it could be.
Do you think it's because what about having low barrier to play? Do you think incorporating too much technology will create too many barriers for people?
I think as long as it's things that you use in your normal life, right? Like utilizing technology that's used in your normal life, and I think that there's always the place for more traditional games that just use paper, and I love that kind of game. I just think that one of the things I see underutilized currently in the industry is utilizing the level of tech that we can, right? Those kinds of games can exist alongside the others.
Cleo?
I want more weird, surreal stuff. Generally, like I want like theater of the absurd, but in RPG format, and that's just something that I always just love surrealism in general. I really enjoy games that are inspired by, like, let's say, like David Lynch. Right, there is
Something is wrong
something
here.
is wrong here. Yeah,
Yes.
I love Something Is Wrong Here by Kira McGrath. And that is that's technically a LARP, but I have run it digitally as like a tabletop RPG essentially. But I like the idea of RPGs being inspired by other art forms. So things like immersive theater. I really like the question of like finding who is your character. Do you know exactly who they are at the beginning, or are you starting off more as an audience member, kind of, and figuring out who you are and how you relate to the world as things go? I like weird stuff. And I really enjoy seeing it when people go like just way off the deep end with like, okay, this is technically maybe not even a game anymore. This is just like a weird shared improvisation exercise, but boxed up kind of like a game, and I'm really into that stuff.
It reminds me of drama class.
Yes. To touch on something that you said, something that what you said spurred was another thing I think has been new to RPGs, maybe just in codifying, and I'm not sure. I think it was Vincent Baker, if I'm not mistaken, but just the idea of playing to find out seems to be a new term to define something that maybe we've done as humans all along, but like when it's reinforced in the rules that you're okay to not know who your character is fully, it's okay to not know what's going to happen, it's okay for the GM not to have a plan and just to listen to the players and what they want to do and respond. That feels new and exciting to me, and is sort of in that space that you're talking about, Cleo.
Yeah.
Christopher.
Unfortunately, my answer is probably going to be the least helpful. One because it went last, so I guess everyone else's trajectory sounds really great. Because I'd love to comment on especially the werewolf in particular, which is I'm lead dev on, but I don't know how much I can talk about because we're still talking with Paradox for this and that. But it does involve bringing a lot more people whose experiences understand the cultural backgrounds that were supposed to be behind werewolf, and actually makes it far more interesting if you're going to be to be completely honest. So that kind of stuff is happening a lot more, thankfully. Is that sort of understanding of where these things came from, and then, like I said, to a set, like you mentioned, Cleo, informed by other art forms, also informed by other perspectives and cultures and whatnot, which is making it a little bit more interesting because you feel like you're stepping, even if you're not familiar with it, you feel like you're stepping into something that you don't understand but could learn about, which is interesting by itself. As far as also like to see, I mean, I don't know. My answer is really unhelpful because I've seen a lot of games already that kind of do what I thought we should be doing in general. There's so much out there. It's hard to say, well, we need to have more of X because Y is not there, but Y is there. It's like a matter of just how deep you want to dive or how back do you want to get. Now, what you want may not be, strictly speaking, new, but it's there. And that's the kind of nice thing about it. Like, there's something for everybody. If you want to play something more like this and more like that, then you can just find it. And so to me, it's like the question is like, well, how badly do you want to look for what's already there? But I said that's, as a lead developer, I know it sounds kind of bad, but I'm being completely honest. Like I don't like developing stuff I don't see being done. Like I see being done someplace else. Like I did Altered Carbon because I wanted to see a cyberpunk game that wasn't quite so crunchy. Now, it's still got a little bit of that because it's got a lot of gear customization, but that game didn't exist. Therefore, I wanted to make it. Same thing with Outbreak Undead. You know, there were zombie games out there, but not like realism-based survival horror, test your own zombie survival plan. That game didn't exist, so I wanted to make it. So that, of course, as time goes on, the things that don't exist are going to be fewer and fewer. And I don't know what that's going to look like when there's going to just be so much that there's going to be spoiled for choice. But yeah, I mean, again, I'm sorry to say that this is about as much as I can talk about it because I see so much that I don't know where else we could go without. Before I see it, it's like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't see that before. And maybe that's because I'm not being very creative or trying that hard. But at the same time, it speaks to the kind of range of things that are available in the industry already. That's a good thing. You know, there's lots of stuff that's there for people who are of all levels of accessibility. And I think you mentioned this, Spencer, with technology. Incorporating stuff that people are familiar with, that makes it even easier to get into something if you weren't into it before. It's just more ways to kind of get into the sort of gaming space that we are developing things for is always good because you can share more when people have inroads into the same plays.
Yeah, and I think platforms like itch.io have really provided a way for unique and experimental design to be accessible to people in a more, much easier than it would have been 10 years ago. Like you couldn't find the games that are on itch published by publishers even now, probably. Like they are niche experiences, but some of those things are things that we really want to play. And itch and drive-through sort of make those available to us, which is really neat.
Mm-hmm. So then now we're going to kind of get into a bit of the meat and potatoes here about design. And you're all here because you're bringing something unique to the design field. So what is your design process? We'll start with you first, Christopher, this time around.
Okay, well, no, that's fine. So there's a few approaches, and the first thing is what serves the setting the best. You think about what kind of game you want to make, and then once you kind of figure out what sort of setting, what sort of mechanics, what style would work best for that, you kind of lay out the groundwork for it. And I think starting with the core mechanic is the best way to start with because you figure out everything has to fall back on that if people are just improvising. So that's your first thing, and then you do what are the exceptions to that. Like these are the things that will eventually be like your bonuses or your penalties and what causes them. And then there are a whole series of things which I would call, and quite literally they're called in Altered Carbon and in Outbreak Undead, they're called triggered effects. What causes these things to being and what those things actually are. And so that's a very mechanical approach to it. I mean, obviously you flesh it out with story and context to make it more interesting. But when you're talking about making a game that has a mechanical backbone, you got to make sure that everything kind of falls back into one of those three categories. And if they can reference each other, then you've got a consistent system. And I think consistency is the key. Because I said, I'm doing Werewolf, the Apocalypse right now. And I have a humongous respect for the World of Darkness systems in general, because you could teach that system in 15 minutes. You can the core mechanics explained in 30 seconds. I know this for I have done this. So that sort of, but that's because they cared to make everything work on a similar mechanic. And so even if you didn't know it, you can kind of guess it, and you're probably right. So that's my approach to doing games. Obviously, I have a more traditional background in that. I think everyone else is going to have a little more interesting and different takes on from a creative standpoint. But I think when you're talking about mechanics and the games that utilize them pretty heavily, that's probably how I go about doing it. Anyway, that's my process.
Mm-hmm. I know I played Werewolf in VTM. I LARPed in the 90s. And we didn't roll dice. We did paper, rock, scissors to decide everything. Just like
Right.
we streamed it down a little bit more. So Doug, what about you, your process?
It's been getting better. It didn't used to be that good. So I love co-designing because I've learned so much from my co-designers. So people like Banana Chan or John Gilmore and Spencer and Cleo have helped me get a lot better at focusing on the experience that I want players to have. And so so for the game that Cleo and I are working on, we want that sort of second kind of fun for players to kind of feel bad. And so the choices that we're making, we're trying to make players make choices that force them to do that, which is quite a sentence. But the focus on, okay, so this is the experience we want players to have while they're playing. How can the theme, how can the mechanics work together to reinforce that? And so sometimes it starts with a mechanical idea. Sometimes it starts with a very thematic idea. Sometimes it starts somewhere in the middle, somewhere along that spectrum. But yeah, I think what I'm striving for in my design process is to focus on experience and how simply can the rules be set up to give people that experience. Like with Kids on Brooms, that's something we focused on so much with Magic. When we were getting to that point, I was like, okay, I have a way to re-envision this Magic system, and wrote up an 8-page thing. And then Spencer and John read it and were like, how about this thing? And now it's a 2-page thing that I think works. It's 4 tables. And I think it just works much better because it gets to the experience of waving your wand and casting a spell, rather than all right, so we're here. Okay. So you
adding this modifier that relates to this stat, and yeah.
Right. Is that your active
That's
stat for the School of Magic, or is this one? And then, okay. How many times have you gone to class? What's your mother's maiden name? Right.
What's your social security number? Yeah.
Right. The third digit of your social security number is going to get added to it because this is this kind of spell. And just condensing it down to, okay, how weird is the spell? How many times have you cast it? How big is the area of effect? And
how long does it last?
How long does it last? Right. Done. And so getting to the experience rather than the crunch of it.
Mm-hmm. Cleo.
So I talked about this a little bit yesterday on the world building workshop. So if anybody was there, they're probably going to remember some of the things I said. But well, first of all, I really like adapting my process to people who I'm working with. So if I'm co-designing, or if I've been brought on as a writer to work on a world that's already pretty much been fleshed out, I do like having to adapt my general process to whatever other people have been doing, just to kind of see whether that works for me in general. And I like just seeing how other people work, so that can be fun. I know that's not the case for everyone, but if I am kind of at the reins, or I'm kind of free to do what I want, I almost always start with atmosphere, and focus on how do I want the players to feel when they're playing this game. And for me, that generally looks like finding the right music and listening to it a bunch while thinking about how I want the players to feel, kind of like programming my brain to associate this playlist I've created with those feelings, so that if I have it on in the background while I'm working, it'll kind of just keep generating those thoughts for me without me having to think about it quite as hard. And then after atmosphere, and kind of like player emotions and like the tone of the game, I start thinking about who the characters are going to be and how they're going to interact with the world. And it's really the third step is really when I start fleshing out the actual details of the world itself. After I figured out how I want people to feel and how I want them to be interacting with the world. And then mechanics are kind of, honestly, mechanics generally come in around like that point for my general process, because I want to find mechanics that are going to serve those three things, rather than starting with a mechanic and having the story kind of like serve the mechanic. There will be certain times when I have a mechanic that I really want to use, and that will be kind of the pinnacle of the whole thing, and the core of the game, the core of my process. But that is definitely like kind of the outlier situation.
Mm-hmm. Spencer.
Yeah, so I think with the way that games are being built nowadays, there's kind of two ways that I will approach games. It depends on whether I'm building a system from scratch or whether I'm taking an existing system and adapting it to do something else. So like with Brooms, it was a pretty easy process in that I basically just took that system and said, okay, what needs to change from here? What core elements from this can stay, and then what pieces need to be modified to be able to capture the genre that we are, trying to use this new hack for. And so that's pretty straightforward, right? You just identify all the pieces from the current game that are mechanical and how they interact with the genre that it's currently set in, and then you find the way to twist them, to change them, to be able to capture the genre that you're aiming for. And that can be easier if the system is the right system for that genre. Sometimes you wouldn't want to do a kids on bikes game that's like with adults in dark fantasy, right? Like it just wouldn't. That's not really the like feel of the game. So you got to make sure you match it. But I think the more difficult and for me more interesting usually side of the process is when you're starting from scratch, when you don't know what you want to make next, and you're just trying to create a palette for yourself that will get you to that place. So I usually start with, coming from a film and TV background, from a screenwriting background, I usually start with my hook. So that's like, what is the one line that captures what this game is? So with Alice, for example, it was, I had actually with Alice it was interesting because it sort of happened simultaneously in that I also worked through imagery. So I will go on the internet and I'll find an image that really speaks to me, and I will make a whole game around that image sometimes. So with Alice, it was side by side. I found an image that really spoke to me. It was this one. For whatever reason, I don't know why, but this spoke to me. And so I took that image and I put Alice is Missing on it because that felt right. And then I put a silent role-playing game. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And this is generally what happens with Icarus. It was like, it's a game where you stack dice. It's a hook, right? Like, what is the hook for the game? And then you go, okay, what do you... Oh, sorry, hold on. Oh, God. I'm a servant to a dog. Then I take that sort of concept, whatever that hook is, and I try and find the in there. Like, what is that? So for Icarus, it was like, I know I want to stack dice to be able to do a resolution here, because that's the experience that I want the player to have. That's the mechanical hook in some way that I want players to engage with. What genre fits around that, right? And so then there are things like I've spoken about this before, but like I had two sort of thoughts when that dice stacking thing came up, and one of them was, okay, there's we can kind of do two things with this. One of them is like animal populations, because when animal populations get too high, there's like this explosion of population, and then all of a sudden there's this fall that happens, right? Because of there's some, I can't remember what it is, some theory of like how that happens. They eat too much of their environment, and then the population just crashes. And the other thing is humans do that same thing too. Our civilizations always fall. So those are the two kind of things that felt like the more and more you stack them, the closer you are to destruction. And so capturing that kind of thing. With Alice, it was more like how do I utilize silence at the table in an interesting way? And the Quiet Year kind of did this as well, but in a completely different way, but in a way that definitely put that emphasis on silence. The other thing that does that is that's the other Thorny Games. Is it called Sign? The people who did Dialect, they did another one.
Yeah, they did Sign and they did Xenolanguage.
Language, and so those kinds of things like Sign, I think, is silent as well. So looking at inspiration for games that feel similar to the thing I want to make, and playing them, reading them, getting as much in my brain as I can from those things, and then I write up a paragraph before I do anything else. Before I do any like further mechanics, I just write up a paragraph of like what the game is and how I want people to feel when they're playing it. And because I'm very like I tend to be more writerly than I am anything else when I'm designing, and I don't know if writerly is a word, but I'm writerly. And so
you have created a word.
I coined it. I've made it. So anyway, so that's kind of where. So I start from like that inception of like what does this game look like? How does this game make very close to how Cleo was speaking about? Like how does this game make me feel through the title, through the art, right? Especially with Alice, through the music, and use that as a point to come back to. Like I'll keep that image on my screen while I'm designing, so that when I get tired and I'm like, I don't like this game anymore, this game sucks, I'm done with this game, I can go back to that image and look at it and be like, oh no, that's why I like this. That's why I'm making this. And then like you kind of said already, Cleo, finding the mechanics that sort of fit into that experience is so key. You have to find the thing that captures the feeling that you want the players to have, and especially as an experiential sort of game designer, like that's always my goal.
Is there an Icarus module with animals as building the society?
There isn't currently, but we could very well make one.
It's like Pass the Pigs. You just keep stacking the pigs on top of each other.
What is it? Yeah, Icarus Animal. It's Animal Farm.
Yeah, I'd like to. I know we talked about this in quite a bit. If I may, I know it's spoken already. If I may add about, I know this is about unique systems, but I'll talk about how it's involving with a licensed property, which is not a unique thing. It's something else someone else made. So when you're talking about another thing to consider is pacing, and when you look at something like Outbreak Undead, it's not designed to be fast paced. It's meant to be a strategy. How do you survive? Slow burn sort of thing. And then you look at, Werewolf, meant to be pretty quick. It's a storytelling system. But we have Altered Carbon, which is built on the noir tradition, which is not, an action story at all. It's got action in it, but it's in the vein of Dashiell Hammett, and it's got and Raymond Chandler's sort of pulp novels. Like everything's it's quick in the sense it's a short story, but it's not quick in the sense of it's how things are unveiled. And so I think one of the things we did for Altered Carbon, because it's a unique system with an established setting, is that I didn't want combat to be the focus of it, because combat's not so much the focus of the story. It's a crime story at its heart. And so I want to make sure if you feel like you're investigating, and if you were just like a socialite, or if you were someone who was just kind of on the fringes of the action, you still like you're part of the story. And so everything was built kind of around the concept of bringing everyone in the same pacing. So because combat is not fast paced, there's a little bit of strategy to it. It's not as much as Outbreak Undead by a long stretch, but so too is like the narration between the sessions. Because what would happen is if you didn't pace it properly, mechanically speaking, then the action would blow through really quickly because everyone's, oh, well, it's fast paced, want action. But if you blew through that too quickly, then the people who have all the fighting characters would kind of be sitting on their hands while the story was unfolding for everybody else. And that's not exactly fair to really anybody. So I think having that sort of approach to it as well, you're talking about not just the setting, not just the story, but also the rate at which information is presented to the players is also a key component when it comes to designing a system like that. So I just wanted to add that because I forgot to mention it before.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, that's all the questions I had for you, but I know we have some questions from the audience. So why don't we go into the Q&A portion of this?
Good.
We have, what do you think has led to the rise in systems outside of traditional dice-based ones? What do you think caused that shift? Does anyone want to speak up on that one?
I think part of it has to do. Sorry, Doug.
No,
I think part of it has to do with accessibility in general, because as people get more and more excited for games, they want to be able to share it with more people, and that includes people of different ages, people with different levels of experience with these games, and kind of the grittier or the crunchier rather, I guess the mechanics, the harder it is to share that with more people, and also people are busy. They have busy lives. It's already really hard to find time to sit down and play a game. A one shot even sometimes is just hard to schedule. I mean, there's a reason there's a million memes out there about like, why can't I get my group together regularly to play a game? And if you have to add learning a complicated system on top of just finding the time and the emotional energy to play a game, that's just like a whole other thing you have to worry about. And I think it is coming out of a love of games that things are, some of these systems are very straightforward and simple, that people want to be able to play more games, and they want to find games that basically allow them to play them a little bit more easily.
Mm-hmm.
And to dovetail off of that, I think as we're able to play more games more easily, more one-shots, combining that with the proliferation of ways to get games out there and create games inexpensively, putting out a PDF is, compared to 20 years ago, putting out a book, much, much, much easier. And so people can be more experimental because people will try more things. Oh, I'll play that once. I don't have to buy a $50 player book, a $50 Dungeon Master Guide, a $50 Tome of Magic. I don't have to spend $400 to be able to sit down and play this game with these 5 people. I can get this $5 PDF. Boom, I'm good to go. I'll try it. And I think as we experiment with stuff, we see what works and what doesn't work. The old sort of like throw mud against the wall and see what sticks kind of thing. We experiment with stuff, we try stuff out, and then it morphs into something that works a little bit better or a little bit differently. I think that's a big part of why we're seeing all these different kinds of approaches.
I also think we need to attribute at least part of this to video games. Because a lot of the games that we'd play on the computer before modern video games were things, the ones that were built into the system are like Solitaire and Minesweeper, something like that. Anyway, they're sort of traditional. Yeah, sort of these traditional kind of like either strategy or push your luck games or, more board gamey kind of things. And then we had this boom of video games that have been the most popular of which one could argue are essentially interactive movies, right? You look at your God of War and your Last of Us and
Mass Effect.
Mass Effect, any of these that are so prolific, and games went from being something that people played to spark that strategy part of their brain solely, to being games that there's still a little bit of strategy, there's a little bit of like dexterity that has to be done, to be able to like press buttons in time, but it's also really focused on story, like a lot, and so I think that change that happened sort of put a modern gamer, especially video gamers, mindset into, okay, when I'm playing a game, I'm not only expecting to have a sort of challenge in that I have to hit buttons at the right time, but I also want to have an emotional connection to what's happening. I want to feel things based on the story that's being told, and have that be something that is naturally built into the game, not something that they have to work to be able to bring out of the game in some respect. Because you could find a story with Minesweeper, right? But like, it's not built into the game. So I think that with the rise of narrative first video games, we also are seeing this trend of RPGs following suit and taking on more of a narrative role and an experimental role. And there's so many experimental games. I don't know if you all have played what is it called? It just came out. I can't remember it right now, but it's a super experimental game. Kentucky Route Zero. It's a wildly experimental kind of game, and it's a video game, but it takes stuff from music, it takes stuff from visual novels, right, or interactive fiction, and sort of package it into a game that's now available on Xbox and Switch and right, like it's in these mainstream systems, but it's doing weird stuff. So anyway, I think that taking a note from that kind of world where they're making a lot of money doing that, I think that RPGs are finding their own voice in that place as well.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, baby. So, hold on.
Oh, that's all right.
So,
I know
now
it
it's me
well.
having to shoot my young daughter on. Sorry.
That's
So I haven't weighed on this. My take on it is a little bit less. I'll just say it's more industry focused because I'm looking at the trajectory of how things have played out, and I think a lot of it's based on the production methods that have been implemented over the last, I would say, 10 years or so. Because I guess I'm kind of the old timer here when it comes to role playing game development. Back when we started, like in 2010, print on demand wasn't a thing. At least not commercially so. And so the fact that we had a hardcover book from an indie publisher, even though it was black and white at the time, that turned heads. And that by itself was something that drew attention to it. Now you can do that pretty easily. But the fact is that was something that was seen as kind of like a signpost, like, hey, these people took their stuff seriously because they bothered to throw that kind of money behind it without any sort of like backing from a large company. So I think when the production methods become more accessible, you see people take more risks, and that's why you're seeing a huge explosion of people who are just willing to, like, as Doug said, just throw mud against the wall and see what sticks. And so you see a lot more people taking those kind of chances. And I think that's good because you get to see, because I mean, and you'll see the most like advanced, not say advanced, I said the most innovative approaches taken by people who can afford to take those kind of risks. Because if you're a big company, you can't afford to lose a mass market. And so what happens is the same thing happened with video games. Spencer, to your credit, you mentioned this too. But I think the loss of the middle market of video games, which is thankfully not, it's starting to crawl back after Steam has become a thing. You see indie titles like Oxenfree coming up and doing really well and stuff like that too. And like ones like this War of Mine, stuff like that. So you see the middle market is where the kind of like the primordial soup where the new ideas that are being pushed into the mass market will exist first. So I think it's exciting to see that the middle market is starting to expand even more with role-playing games and tabletop games in general, because you can see people taking risks and you see people trying things. And you might see that, by osmosis go into stuff that that has, a publicly traded company behind it, perhaps. Another thing I've seen, and this isn't quite so true recently, because the time has passed quite a bit, but once when fourth ed for D&D did substandard, I would say kindly, I saw a lot of people trying to meet the demand of what gap that left behind. And I think that space being created by the utter failure of and I will call it that because they will consider it that. Because I mean, just a bit of an inside scoop. I was talking when that premiered. We did a small convention in Seattle, and we were the only other game company besides Wizards of the Coast. And I was speaking with the developers and basically got them to tacitly admit that this is not doing well, and this is not doing well for us at all. And this is very close on the heels of their release. So I'm not saying anything terribly controversial, but I think that space being created from such a huge monolithic company did give people a rise from the middle market to the top market. And that's why Paizo is doing as well as it did, because it did a very good job of reading the room and giving people what they wanted, but at the same time trying a few things new, but not too many to kind of like alienate the audience the way WotC did with Fourth Ed. Now they've gotten their groove back since then, so it's not quite so true anymore. But I think when you see you could even see some benefit to failure in that respect, even if some people say, yeah, well, this is a good idea in theory, but let's try it in a different way that's better, and then they do it. And I think that's a nice thing to see too, is that it's not just a matter of the market being adjusting for that sort of thing, or processes of production being more accessible. It's also a matter of reading the room and seeing how many people are trying what you're trying, and then trying something different from that if there's a market for it, and not losing too much if it doesn't work. I think just being able to try it is important too, and I think that being able to do that is a relatively new phenomenon. I think that's the best thing that's come out of the lower bar of entry for a lot of new developers.
Nate Parker asks, video games have serious games that simulate train for real-world problems. Ivan Van Norman mentioned RPG as therapy kits in another panel. Do you see RPGs getting more serious in topics they tackle?
Yeah. I'm gonna, and if I may, I'm gonna have to break ranks with Ivan there. He's my partner for Hunters Entertainment. I come from a background in psychology. I think there's a place where role-playing games can exist as therapy, but I think it's extremely dangerous to consider it a kind of replacement for it. Because I have a high regard for people who need therapy. I think that's a very special place that needs to exist independent of a game space. I think that because I think if you're treating your group of friends, as sympathetic as they may be, as your therapist, that's not always the best, because there are such things as enablers. I mean, there are people who can enable what could be from case to case a behavior that's destructive. So I think the compassion element is definitely there, but I think the therapy element needs to be done with a more professional attitude. Now, thankfully, I can't remember her name right now, but there is a therapist who has developed therapy programs around role-playing gaming in particular, and it's been shown, at least in her case, to be an effective tool. And role-playing has been done in therapy before, in a very loose sense of the word. So I'm not saying it's not possible that you shouldn't do it. I just think it needs to be done with a great deal of care, and not just compassion for the subject, but education and knowing full well what you're subjecting players to. And if you're calling it therapy, it better be therapy. It can't be something, it's therapeutic in the general sense. It's like, no, it has to be. I have too much concern with the state of psychology to just lump games into a therapy just because people are there who are listening to you. It's not the same thing.
Were you thinking of Dr. Megan Connell?
Possibly. It's been a while since I spoke. You might.
She does a lot of work with D&D and gaming with young people for therapy.
Well, and I think then the shoe fits. If that's the case, no, the shoe fits. I mean, it doesn't have to be the person I was speaking of specifically, but if something, right. And say that there's a possibility for it to happen, and I'm glad people are trying it, because if it's effective, it's effective. Good for them. Mm-hmm. But I think that the seriousness of a game is not the same thing as being a therapy. Seriousness of tone is not necessarily mean to overcome some sort of trauma. They're two different things. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to make that distinction, and that's something I just want to get out there before we got too much into the discussion.
Yeah, and I think the key distinction is between playing a role-playing game in lieu of therapy versus having a therapist use a role-playing game with their client. I think the first one is incredibly dangerous, and I think the second one, like we've been talking about, has been shown to be incredibly powerful. Yeah, I mean, one of our things for Free Content Friday was even about how to use those not in a therapeutic setting, but in like a pro-social setting. How can parents help their kids learn to be better people through, in our example, using Kids on Bikes, but you could do it with, I mean, really pretty much any game, probably maybe not Fiasco, but using games to help reinforce positive social behavior. That's different from therapy, but it's something that I think
it's a tool.
Can be
Yeah.
very powerful in both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kind of speak to the seriousness, the like the what would it be, the trajectory towards seriousness that's come out of games, because most of the things that I've designed are tend to have pretty heavy topics, and that's purposeful for me because I want. Well, I mean, Kids on Brooms obviously is sort of the lightest thing that I've done publishing wise, because I love that kind of genre. But I think that when we're talking about experiential gameplay, that there is it's easier in some respect to create an experience for somebody in a dramatic setting. And with something like Icarus, you have this dramatic background, but that doesn't mean that the game isn't fun to play. We have a lot of fun. We laugh a lot. We come up with some crazy stuff, and like there's in every game we play of it, there's always moments of levity. But the background is serious enough that it grounds our games in something. And I think even Chris, who's our convention manager here, we played Fiasco with a group the other day, and we sort of got on this topic of how do you creating going in with a focus on having more of a serious tone often lands you with a lot of gaming groups in an area in between, right? If you start off the rails, then where do you go from there? But I think having this undertone of seriousness helps to ground the game sometimes, especially in something like Fiasco, but even more so in something like 10 Candles, which is just like this work of art of a game that is so serious. It's so dark. It's very sad. If you don't know 10 Candles, it's a game you play by candlelight, and you're putting out candles as things go wrong for your characters, and you're all going to die. How the game runs. You're all going to go by the end of it, and once all the candles are out, and all the candles will go out, the game ends and everybody dies. And it's just a matter of how you get there. And that kind of serious dramatic framework allows you to run your characters like stolen cars, because you know what the ending is going to be, and because there's an inherent darkness to that tone. You can go there and you can feel things. And I think that's what, with both Alice and Icarus, I was really trying to capture. Is like I wanted players to be able to have an immersive, visceral experience with their games.
Mm-hmm. I'm a pretty firm believer in that if any art form can touch on a certain theme or subject, then games can do that as well. I think that there is a lot of associations with the word just game, in that people think, okay, a game is something that is supposed to be fun and potentially lighthearted, and there's some levity there, and it's something that's kind of frivolous. And the goal of a game is that you're going to have the kind of the ha-ha version of fun. And I think people have that definition kind of seared into their brain from childhood. And even if they know, that's not true. Games are just, an art form the way anything else is. That's still kind of lodged in there. And so people will see like a game that's about like a certain subject matter or time in history and be like, what? You can't make a game about that. You can't, they think that making a game about it is the same thing as making light of it. But there have been times in history when like novels were considered frivolous and silly and like a waste of time. And when, comic books and graphic novels were considered, kind of like low art. Right. And so there's a lot of like elitism and classism even in just like kind of ingrained in that. But obviously there are graphic novels that tackle extremely serious and terrible events and like very serious subject matters. And now I mean, there's still people who are terrible, but like most people now would not be like, oh, you can't have a graphic novel about that. That's too serious for comics. And I feel like we're starting to get there more and more with games where people are realizing like just because it's a game doesn't mean you're making light of a thing. It's just kind of an interactive way of exploring a certain subject. And that's not to say that any game made about any subject is totally good to go. You can totally make a harmful, hurtful, terrible game about a subject if you're not approaching it respectfully and responsibly. But kind of getting rid of certain topics altogether because they are too serious, I think, is not the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also add to that is that it also, depending on the setting you're talking about, you might just change the concept of what a victory is. And I'm referencing to, I guess Outbreak Undead is an example of that. Is that, you know, you're not going to win by killing all the zombies. That's not the point of the game. The point of the game is to survive as long as you can, and that's such a dismal thing on its face. And you could even say werewolf has got a similar theme too. It's like, you know, how are you gonna what's a victory for a werewolf look like? You know, they tear the dam down. Hooray! I mean, then down road, the floods and kills a whole village of people. And it's like there's always a matter of like cascading consequences that come along with that discussion. And so I think when it comes to the approach to more serious settings, is talking about a less, I guess, more shades of gray when it comes to the morality of the decisions your characters make. And that's not for everybody, obviously. Sometimes you want to be escaping, you want to feel like the hero, which is great. But I think when you're talking about a serious subject, it's one that introduces the idea that there is a different outcome that can be than what you expected. And it's not always a good one. And even in, like I said, again, for Outbreak Undead, we have actually things called the moral gray, in that you take the exact same situation, and you can look at it from two completely different perspectives and have it be have it be completely understandable on both sides of the thing, but your players have to decide where they land on this. And it might be easier, some might be easier than others just by virtue of what they personally think is important. But it also introduces the idea that they may not be right. And I think that's an interesting new dynamic that we're introducing with the idea of having it be a serious subject. And I think that's, to me at least, that's what it means when you're talking about introducing a more serious game. It's more along the lines of not just being a moral binary, you're the good guys or the bad guys sort of thing. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Larry Neal Jr. asks, in reference to world building, does anyone write specific story beats only, or do you write a full structured story piece to work from?
So for Kids on Brooms, I did the writing for the example text, which tells a focused story throughout. And for that came last. That was the very, well, almost the very last finished piece in there. So we definitely started with if I'm understanding the question right, the structure of the rules, and then move those around, decided what would make the most sense to put where, rather than saying we're going to go here, 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 here in terms of a story.
Mm-hmm. Can you read the question again for me?
Yeah. Chris, could you bring that question back up? Thank you. In reference to world building, so does anyone write specific story beats only, or a full structured story piece to work from? So essentially, yeah. Do you work with beats or a structured story piece?
I think I misunderstood.
So I'm not sure. In world building, yeah, that's the part that's confusing me. But I think that if you're building the backstory of the world, which is maybe what they're speaking about, I think that having it be something you have a general understanding of, and allowing the players to sort of flush out interesting things as well, they're going to give you more stuff than you could ever think of if you give them the opportunity. They're going to bring you stuff you never would have imagined. So by just creating sort of a framework of what you think that backstory is, you can get your players to, you can ask them questions about like, you find ruins here. What do they look like? What are they ruins of? And then they give you that, and then you work off of that. If that's your style of gameplay, oftentimes that brings in players a lot more, because now all of a sudden that's been informed by their perspective, as opposed to them just listening to you almost like a book. If we're talking about adventure module kind of things, I think always story beats are the way to go there, and it's actually preferred to go like, here's sort of I'll do a 5 squares and just start filling them in as we go, and just know I have 5 acts to get us through an adventure module. If it's something that's not written, if I just know I'm doing a one shot, I'm trying to take them through an adventure. Like you got your beginning, you got your inciting incident, you have your midpoint, you have your climax, and you have your ending. And if you are able to fill in all those boxes as you go and know that you have to hit each of those beats, you'll tell a whole adventure through that. But it's about knowing that structure going into your game and being able to corral your players enough while giving them the freedom to explore the story they want. I'm not sure if that's exactly on question, but it's similar, I think.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have anything to add, or we can move on to the next one?
I actually have a question for Cleo about that one. To put you on the spot, for your adventure for Adventures Volume 1, how did you approach that?
So that was interesting, right? Because it was an adventure setting, but it was also very much kind of like focused on the town. And that one was No Such Place as Koreatown, which kind of takes place in like late 90s, Northern Virginia, Koreatown. And that was a lot of kind of like, here's a bunch of seeds that you can run with, and like, here's a bunch of things you could pair up together in different combinations. Because I'm a big fan of like tables and things where you kind of like serve a menu to the GM or the players, and they get to look and see like, okay, I can see how there's a completely interesting, unique story here if I combine like this one and this one and this one. And often I find that players are more invested in a story and their characters, the more of a hand that they have in creating this, like kind of the very initial story setup and the world building. And so for that one, that was definitely a kind of a, here's a bunch of ingredients, use them as you would like. Whereas other projects I have worked on, other adventure things. Oh, you were talking about the... I
was talking about Teens in Space, yeah.
Oh, you're talking about that. Okay, you cut out for a second, so I couldn't... I assumed. Oh, yes, that one. I wasn't sure whether we could talk about that yet or not, but yeah, that one was very much... I don't even... Well, we're talking about it, so...
Pause for a second. Anyway.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll be broad. I'll be very general. But yeah, that one was much more... Like it is, there are story beats. There's kind of the way I like to structure, and this is how I structure most of my adventures that I'm writing. And for the Teens in Space thing, that was a lot of world building and also the adventure kind of hand in hand. But it is kind of like, here's a beat, and this beat is pretty fleshed out and what's kind of supposed to happen here. Or, there's always going to be some wiggle room, right? And then here is kind of a few paths you could take to this next beat. And here's a lot more freedom and a lot more wiggle room, because players can just go completely off the rails, do whatever they want to get to this next point. Here are some suggestions to get there. But I like that kind of structure of like, here's something that's a little bit tighter and more defined. Here's a lot of freedom. Here's something a little bit more tighter, more defined. And then here's more freedom. Because I find that as a GM, that's what I appreciate the most.
Yeah. And I would say, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, this is a conversation with you two. You guys finish that up. I'm late.
Okay. And like to sort of build off of that, I really think it depends on what you're going for. That for a game of, like Spencer said, for like a one shot of kids on bikes or kids on brooms or Teens in Space, like you have that sort of general structure that any good story usually falls into, or most good stories fall into. But then for something like the Red Death, the podcast that I'm GMing for, I went in knowing like, I think this is how these are going to be the story beats, but having the flexibility to change stuff based on like Cleo's character has really surprised me throughout the thing. And so stuff has changed that I thought was going to happen at the end. Now I think something else is going to happen, and stuff could still happen where it goes back to being the thing that I thought first or something completely different. But knowing what you're working towards, even if you're able to be flexible about it, I think is really, really important for telling a better story.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with all that. And a lot of it is based on the kind of group you're running. And this is so much, it's not like a industry wide thing. This is more like a, you got to read the room sort of thing. I know it's easy to kind of, say, well, my group likes this and this group likes something completely different. I've always found that when you put a lot of care into the world building, in the sense that you give them something that you've given a sense that you have actually put some thought into it. Not that, well, what do you guys think it is? Because if you do, the more you do, the less they feel that you've really thought ahead of this. Even if you have bulleted things out that would actually make sense, there's a certain gut reaction. It's like, well, am I telling the story or are you? And if there's no sense of collaboration, if they don't know that walking into it, they might be put off by that. And I've kind of felt both ends of the spectrum on that. I've had people who were basically aspiring fantasy writers, and I was in their novel, and that was just, it was its own thing. But I've also had situations where I personally planned out, I thought it was really clever, and then my players threw me a curveball. I'm like, well, I guess I'll take the L there, but that's really clever. Let's go with that. And I think as long as you have the I guess the capacity or the flexibility to move with the direction your players in, as long as it's not totally bogus, because if they're doing something dumb, then they should be punished for that. I think if they're going to climb a tree to get a survey to land during a lightning storm and they're wearing full armor, they should probably get struck by lightning. That's just the way things. Oh, I'm going to go swimming across this river in full plate mail. Well, good luck with that. So there's some decisions I think should be punished because they're not really well thought out. But if they, deliberated and thought about something that was interesting that basically threw you a curve or did something that you weren't expecting, don't punish them for that. I think that's important. But that's more of a GM thing as opposed to like a game development thing. I think as long as you give people the ability to kind of play the room one way or the other, because I'm also a fan of tables and stuff too. But there's also a danger with that people that feel that they want to work with their particular story, and unless it happens to be a story that you're telling them already, they may feel put up as like, well, I don't want to go in this direction. This is something that is totally out of my hands. But at the same time, if you use it as a menu, you just kind of pick and choose the words best based on the trajectory of the story you're telling. Well, then at least the table's there for you to reference. You don't have to roll on it, but you can read it. And that's what I do mostly if I'm running games, to be honest with you. So, I mean, as long as you're presenting them the tools to kind of develop it in the way they want to, so they don't feel like they're leaving anything out. As a developer, you don't want to lose. Well, they clearly didn't think about this thing that I came up with. Well, if you say, well, we kind of did, but we didn't want to lead you on too much. We want to kind of see what you brought to the table. Just give them the ability to like work with what you give them, not just hold their hand the entire way. Because the training wheels have to come off at some point in time. But by the same token, you can't just like throw in the middle of the world and expect to make sense of it, because the sandbox element, as we've discovered with earlier versions of Outbreak Undead, it's a very daunting thing. If you give the world too big, they won't know where to go. So you give them some constraints. It's like, okay, well, here's the story, here's the setting, here's the people you have interacted with in the past that do not treat you well. They're your de facto enemies for the time being, and the story can develop from there. But you give them some parameters. So I think that's the balance you got to strike, is you got to give them some room to grow, while at the same time showing that you have put some care into the world building, so to the extent that they don't feel like they're telling the story for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think tangentially related to that from a design perspective, something I think is really important is to look at how you as a designer are building your game. As far as sessions are concerned, number of sessions are concerned. And I think that's something that's often overlooked I don't know if it's overlooked by the rules writers, or whether it's overlooked by the actual designers themselves, or what it is. But there's not many games that go, hey, you should probably play about 10 sessions of this, or hey, this runs best at about 20 sessions, or this runs best in 3 sessions. I think knowing how your game let me back that up. I think the mechanics themselves can help to inform how much you should be playing the game. For instance, masks. We were talking about that before. I think masks runs best at about 10 to 12 sessions. After that, sort of a played out that character. You could always switch characters and do something else, but like that game is, I feel, intrinsically designed to run about that long. And then there are one-shot games, right? And one-shot games need to be structured in an even more specific way, where you know, games that run for 3 to 10 sessions can have upgrades, but you want players to be able to upgrade pretty fast so that by the end of that 10 sessions, they've reached everything. They've gotten to the peak of their character and they feel comfortable retiring, right? Where you look at something like D&D and you could be playing that for years. That's a design choice. But I think it's a design choice that has to be made by you as a designer. Otherwise, your mechanics might not, all of your mechanics might not fit together in the way that they should, right? Your upgrades for some things might max out at like 4 sessions, but if your character's is designed to go 25 sessions, then you know your crew upgrades and your character upgrades are out of sync. Anyway, I think as designers and then also as GMs, we should be thinking about how many sessions we run through with players and how we can, you know, if we give our players 5 sessions to be able to play in this game and know that we're going to have an arc, that oftentimes creates a more volatile sort of game in a sense. People don't dawdle when they know they only have 5 sessions, and so you can sort of imply that by your design, but also as a GM.
Mm-hmm. We have one last question before the end of this panel. We have it from Tabletop Bellhop, whom I know actually. So hi, Mo. What is something that should be left in the past? A method of play, mechanic, topic, genre, etc.
There's so much.
Yeah. I think the culture of gatekeeping is something that I want to see destroyed, like utterly obliterated in every way possible. There is a weird mindset from what tend to be, for one reason or another, more traditional gaming spaces, that only people that are really good at the rules already, or only people that look and act like them, can be part of their game. And we need to just eradicate that thinking within our hobby. It has no place in it. We have such a variety of games, such a variety of players, and our games are always better for having those voices in them. So I think we need to knock down those barriers.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
I have a corollary to that. I think because it's a very a wide range of possible options for gaming, there's also I don't have a hardline stance on gatekeeping, because I think there's a certain amount of integrity that needs to be kept to keep the game what it is. Now, I always use the analogy, I don't want to just demolish gatekeeping. I do want to have what is called, I would consider, a waiting room, where you have ambassadors say, here, there's plenty of things for you if you look for it. And I think there needs to be some sort of, I guess, ambassadorship to show, here's this, here's that, here's this, here's that. Because I can't think of anything that's weird, that if you go into something thinking it's not, and then you demand it to be changed based on your own personal whims. Like, I would never go to play Kids on Bikes and say, I want to be a Grimdark now. I want to be a scary game. And then I want to subject everyone else to that.
I don't think that's what I'm referring to in gatekeeping. What I'm referring to in gatekeeping is if somebody sat down at your table and was like, hi, I want to play with you. I don't know the rules. Can you teach me? And they go, get out. That's what I'm talking about, gatekeeping. Or somebody sits down that looks or acts different than you, that you know, or isn't within your normal gaming group, but is interested in playing the game. Like, I think we should be inviting to everybody at the table. And for some reason, there are some people who aren't, and that's something that has always been it hasn't made sense to a lot of us in the story gaming community, hopefully, but with traditional gaming can sometimes be the case, and I think that it's important to knock down those barriers for them, not change the game. Obviously the game's going to run the way it is, and that they should be able to run the game, you know, the way that they're going to, but like from a player perspective.
Right. And I think there's a lot of, like I said, especially when it comes to more complicated games, I think as far as reaching out to making sure people want to learn the games, because like, you know, it's, if, like I said, because there's such a huge range of possible games out there, that there's got to be something that you like. And it's kind of tough as a developer when you're seeing so much good stuff out there. It's like, well, where can I live? Where's my stuff going to be? But invariably, if you look hard enough, you'll find a niche that isn't occupied, and you'll have your own unique thing on it. You know, Spencer, your games are a good example of that. I think, you know, the kids titles too, you know, they very much hit the sweet spot of, you know, I want to play something with my friends or my kids even, and have them all feel like we're kind of on the same level of stuff, you know. So I think the fact that these things exist show that there is at least an olive branch being put out there to anyone who wants to come and take it, to jump into the game space in ways they weren't expecting to. I think that's the beauty of the way things are going, and I'm glad to see it. So I will say, as far as like what I would like to see go away, I don't know if that's the right attitude, because I think if you bury something, it'll be dug up eventually, and without context, you wouldn't know what you're looking at. And I think it's a matter of like picking what you would like to see done more of and do more of that, as opposed to doing less of something else. And that's kind of my approach, is doing more as opposed to less. That's just my development thing. And you bring in more people that way, because people are going to want to see, well, I want to see what you're doing this more of. I want to see more of this, more of that. Like I said, that's how we're doing Werewolf. We're bringing in, like, I'm the lead developer of Werewolf, but I am not the head writer. I brought in people who know the cultures, they know their stuff, their backgrounds, to understand it better than I ever could, and they're making it a better game for it. So I think when you're talking about that, we're not talking about, because we're talking about, especially this with Werewolf in particular, it's got a whole backlog of lore behind it. You know, if you just go out through it with a blowtorch and say, well, that stuff didn't happen, well, I mean, you're not only are you lying, you're setting up a precedence that basically, you know, there's nothing but an eternal present, you know, as opposed to it being a history. And I think it's important to showcase that if you're going to be in this game that has this backstory, it has some sort of trajectory that brought it to where it's at right now, if only for context, to make it more believable. I think that makes it a more interesting game, for one. And I think you're being more respectful of the cultures you're referencing in particular, because I think when you're showing that you're making these moves in that direction to include them more, especially if they know what they're talking about, then you're showing deference to them they were not before. But if you knew where it came from, you wouldn't know anything about that. You wouldn't know that all these strides have been made to begin with. So I think having the context is important as well, as opposed to just saying, well, I want to do less of that. I think more is generally better. This is my opinion on it.
Cleo, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, just real quick, because there's a whole list, right? But I would like to direct people to my friend James Mendez Hodes. That's Hodes. He has a blog where he covers he has a lot of really great articles about just like really problematic and offensive stuff that comes up in games. And additionally, I would like to see less of like this really weird hardcore resistance to safety mechanics in games, because I feel like the safety mechanics aren't going to hurt your game. And if you're relying as a GM on upsetting people and shocking people with your really, really like grimdark content, maybe you're not that good of a storyteller, and you should find other ways to tell stories.
But I'm an edgelord. It's what I do.
Yeah.
I want to triple down on that safety mechanics thing. We need to make sure our players feel safe and are and protected, and like they are being listened to at the table. And I know that there's been resistance to it, but like it's part of the discussion. And if you're not implementing those, then you're disrespecting your players, and that's all there is to it. Do the ones that work for you, but make sure your players feel safe always.
Well, Thank you, Tabletop Bellhop, for that question. And I think we are running out a little bit of time here. So why don't we say goodbye, one person at a time, who you are, what you've been doing, and where we can find you. Chris? Or Christopher? Do you prefer Chris or Christopher?
My professional name is Christopher, just because most people don't say it. So when they know the say Christopher, they're talking to me, as evidenced just right now. But no, I mean, I go by either. It's okay. So yeah, I'm Chris De La Rosa. Thanks for listening, all. You can, I mean, I the company man, so you can go to Hunters Entertainment. You'll kind of see what we're all about. You see what we're doing. We're working on Alter Carbon, Outbreak into Second Edition. Our Werewolf is coming up, and of course, all the great games. Alice is Missing on Kickstarter now, developing all that stuff too, and all the kids' titles too. Looking forward to that. So anyway, that's me. Okay.
Doug.
Goodbye.
Doug Lewandowski, freelance game designer, he, him, and you can find me on Twitter at Levzilla. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great to talk and hear what everybody else had to say as well.
Yeah, Spencer.
Yeah, I'm Spencer Stark. I designed Icarus and co-designer of Kids on Brooms and designer of Alice is Missing, which is on Kickstarter now. And you can find me at Spencer Stark on Twitter and Instagram. Yeah, it was such a pleasure talking with you all and hearing what you had to say. Thank you so much.
Cleo.
Yeah, I'm Cleo. You can find me pretty much anywhere online at CYS Davis. So that's Twitter, Patreon, Instagram, what have you. And there's a Teens on Space thing that's going to be happening. It's going to come out one day. That's what I'll say about that.
And I'm Victoria Rogers. I've been your host. I am the social media coordinator for Renegade Game Studios. I'm also brand ambassador for Roll20 and a host for them as well. We have a new show coming up, so keep your eyes open for that. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in and sticking around for the rest of the con. Thank you.